Video game companies who rely far too heavily on loot boxes for their business should be scared about the future, as more and more evidence continues to mount that loot boxes are in fact linked to gambling, which is why we have seen government officials around the world, particularly in the UK, calling for the immediate regulation of loot boxes and labeling them as gambling and regulating them as such. And the most recent evidence comes from research conducted by a charity called Gamble Aware, who commissioned the University of Plymouth and the University of Wolverhampton to look into loot boxes and the kinds of negative effects they could have on customers, on kids and adults alike. And this right here is a 50-page or so report, and I'm not going to go through all of this. Instead, here's a BBC article that summarizes all of this in an article labeled "Loot Boxes Linked to Problem Gambling in New Research." And one of the first things that they spotlight is that researchers at the universities of Plymouth and Wolverhampton found that loot boxes are structurally and psychologically akin to gambling, basically reiterating the obvious, but the obvious needs to be continually reiterated because game companies continue to deny the obvious. They continue to remain willfully ignorant about the harm that they're causing through their monetization model, through their unethical monetization. And it's not just adults who engage with this stuff. The studies found that a large number of children are opening loot boxes. And speaking of children, of the 93% of children who play video games, up to 40% opened loot boxes. Think about that for a second. Of all the children who play video games, almost half of them are engaging in gambling-like activities that might be conditioning them to become addicted to this stuff, that might have long-term psychological ramifications. And this happens because parents aren't aware of loot boxes because there's no disclosure from game companies or video game organizations that are supposed to protect customers, whether it's the ESA, the ESRB, PEGI, you name it. They keep labeling games with gambling-like elements as PEGI 3 or E for everyone, basically completely complacent to this narrative that loot boxes are surprise mechanics and that they're quite fun and quite ethical, that they're like Kinder eggs and are nothing like gambling. If you really want loot boxes that are nothing like gambling, well, you can purchase a Yong surprise mechanic loot box shaped stress boxes that you can just squeeze whenever you're stressed about anything, or you can pretend this is an actual loot box and just squeeze the life out of it or punch it in the face. Whatever it is, it's a fun product, actually fun and ethical. Yongya.com, you'll be able to find these alongside shirts, hats, etc. But anyway, back to the news. Another important statistic is presented by this bullet point. About 5% of gamers generate half the entire revenue from loot boxes. And according to The Guardian's coverage of this research, video game companies are making about £700 million annually by selling loot boxes. That's about almost $1 billion a year that they're making, and half of that, about $500 million of that, comes only from 5% of gamers, who obviously are the whales who are addicted to this stuff, which goes to highlight that this narrative that people love loot boxes is completely false. A small percentage of them who are addicted to this stuff or are so rich that they can actually afford to spend that much money on this stuff, they're the ones ultimately who are dictating the direction that these games take, because game companies, greedy game companies, will take games in the direction that will make the most profit, and they're appealing to that 5% of gamers who are addicted rather than appealing to the masses who want the best experience possible, which often involves not implementing monetized loot boxes, because it is almost universally agreed that implementing those kinds of loot boxes and the way they're implemented in such a greedy manner where the probabilities are so low, where the alternative is grinding insufferably, doesn't actually enhance the experience. It tends to harm it. So the way EA has designed FIFA Ultimate Team and the way it is basically a pay-to-win gambling system, yeah, that is derived from the results they're seeing from a minority of gamers rather than what the masses are requesting out of modes like that and an experience like that. Here's another fun bullet point. 12 out of 13 studies on the topic have established unambiguous connections to problem gambling behavior. As game companies continue to deny the connection between loot boxes and gambling and disagree with all of the evidence presented, we're learning that an overwhelming majority of studies conducted on loot boxes present evidence highlighting how it is not just some vague connection. There is very much a direct link, a direct correlation between loot boxes and problem gambling behavior, and one can fuel the other. And the folks most likely to engage with loot boxes are young men with young age and lower education, correlating with increased use. Indeed, the lack of education on this matter is another element worth considering, and game companies aren't doing a good job at educating people about the potential harmful nature of loot boxes. They're not even being neutral about it. They're going the opposite direction by claiming that, again, loot boxes are fun surprises, they're completely ethical, no links to gambling whatsoever, completely safe to use, to engage in for both kids and adults. They're encouraging people, young gamers in particular, to participate in gambling. They're saying it's a good thing. The research also spotlighted how many games use a psychological nudge to encourage people to buy loot boxes, such as the fear of missing out on limited time items or special deals. FOMO is a big part of how they incentivize people to purchase loot boxes before the reward that people would desire with the extremely low probability runs out, and that leads to mass spending in the days leading up to that deadline. That is a powerful psychological manipulator that has worked wonders for these exploitative game companies and their awful business models. BBC then highlights how one of the authors talked about how gamers do put financial value in things that are rewarded through loot boxes. Many gamers do ascribe discrete financial values to loot box contents based on purchase or resale price, suggesting that many loot boxes meet existing criteria for gambling regulation. Indeed, there are plenty of loot boxes where you can cash out, whether we're talking about Counter-Strike, which has this skin gambling system where players can earn thousands of dollars off of the rarest rewards. FIFA, while they don't officially sanction these third-party gambling websites, the fact of the matter is that they've established a platform for these third-party gambling websites to thrive, and so you can technically cash out with FIFA, so on and so forth. But beyond the monetary value of these items, you've got what I like to call emotional value, especially for kids who don't think about saving money. You know, the reason kids want money is so that they can spend it on stuff that they like, whether it's toys, candy, or cosmetics in Fortnite, whatever it is. And that's because kids don't think about the long-term future. They think about the present and what they want now, and the emotional value that they put on Fortnite skins and cosmetics and pay-to-win elements, whatever it is. That emotional value is important, because sometimes emotional value can have a greater pull than financial value. So even if we're dealing with loot boxes where it's only cosmetics and there's no way to resell that stuff or cash out, that's still gambling, because players who are emotionally attached to something specific, to a specific reward, will spend, if they're addicted, however much money to earn that thing that they really want. Going back to the statistic of how only 5% of gamers, these whales, account for half of the annual loot box revenue of these companies. Again, roughly $500 million spent by only 5% of gamers on these loot boxes. Research found that these people, these whales, spend more than £70 or more than $100 a month on loot boxes. But these are not necessarily wealthy people who earn lots of money. These whales are not necessarily wealthy. They cannot necessarily afford to spend that much money on loot boxes. But that's the thing about addiction. It's something that people just cannot help, because some people, you know, their brains, their minds, their psychology are wired in a certain way where they engage in compulsive spending, compulsive behavior, and these are the people that loot boxes target to squeeze out the most money out of them, to take advantage of them. And to that effect, one of the researchers said this: "Our research therefore demonstrates that game developers, unwittingly or not, appear to be generating outsized loot box profits from at-risk individuals. These are likely to include both people with gambling problems or problematic patterns of video gaming, but not from wealthy gamers." So with all of this in mind, here's what the authors of the conducted research recommended. First of all, regulation that does eventually, hopefully, arrive has to have extremely precise definitions to avoid any possible workarounds. Game companies will no doubt look for loopholes, and they have already been doing that by, for example, separating the direct financial transaction of loot boxes through in-game premium currency. So technically, you're buying the premium currency, not the slot machine spins, the loot boxes, and that degree of separation might give them legal leeway to engage like this, even if loot boxes were to be regulated as gambling. So wording has to be precise to maybe account for stuff like that. And as for what kinds of regulations should be put in place, well, the recommendations include that loot boxes are included in game labeling and age ratings. So not some useless, oh, this game has in-game purchases, which is such a large umbrella that encompasses both more ethical forms of monetization and the more egregious forms of monetization, like the gambling. And ensuring that age ratings represent the inclusion of gambling-like elements, that's a big one. Games like FIFA being labeled E for everyone is a travesty when Ultimate Team, the most popular mode, is rife with psychologically harmful gambling elements that many kids who are fans of sports and soccer and football engage with. Other recommendations include that the odds of winning items be clearly shown, including the average cost of enough boxes to obtain a rare item, establishing spending limits, and more. This is a really interesting idea right here that I didn't think of. Actually show how much money you would have to spend on average for you to be able to earn a rare item. So instead of just saying this is a legendary rare item, maybe say you'd have to spend maybe about $2,000 because of how the odds are for you to have the chance of potentially earning this. And obviously you may get that rare item sooner or later. That's part of the gamble of engaging with loot boxes. But by showing an average amount of money you'd have to spend, at least people have some idea as to how costly engaging with loot boxes might be. And that might be a good regulation to implement, because if people see, oh, that's going to take $2,000 for me to get, I don't know, Messi in FIFA, then they might actually think twice about engaging with that system. So that is a good idea worth spotlighting. And then here are some more quotes of other researchers and people involved in the study expressing their concerns. We have also demonstrated that at-risk individuals such as problem gamblers, gamers, and young people make disproportionate contributions to loot box revenues. And then the chief of Gamble Aware expressed that the charity was increasingly concerned that gambling is now part of everyday life for children and young people. It is now for politicians to review this research as well as the evidence of other organizations and decide what legislative and regulatory changes are needed to address these concerns. Fortunately, in the UK in particular, plenty of legislators are actively looking into research and are awaiting research for them to make a final deliberation. And, plenty of legislators have already, even before this article and this study came out, have expressed adamantly that they believe loot boxes should be immediately regulated. They're also seeing the obvious fact that loot boxes are really not that different from gambling. Now, in response to all of this, the UKIE, the organization representing video games in the UK, already provided an asinine response, claiming that they've already taken action to mitigate the potential harm of loot boxes, but what they highlight here is not a convincing case at all, as you'll see. Probability disclosure has already been introduced to the major game platforms. No, not really. Games like FIFA, for example, list that a rare item has a less than 1% chance of yielding, but less than 1% could mean 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million, 1 in a billion, which makes a huge difference in terms of the viability of obtaining that incredibly rare item. A new paid random item descriptor was added to the PEGI age rating system to inform players of their presence in games. Saying something has random items doesn't say much of anything. It doesn't highlight the potential dangers. There's no warning saying, beware, this shouldn't be something kids should be engaging with. And this goes doubly true when the age ratings don't reflect the inclusion of loot boxes, when games like FIFA are labeled E for everyone. For those who don't know, this is what the label looks like. In-game purchases includes random items in small print, and their age rating is labeled teen. This doesn't say gambling, it says random items, because they want to mitigate the potential of customers potentially looking at the age rating, looking at the word gambling and going, oh, this is not for kids, because they do want to sell these games to kids, because they know how susceptible kids are to purchasing microtransactions items and engaging with loot boxes en masse. being groomed to continue engaging with this stuff. And finally, the UKIE emphasized how there are settings and tools on all major game devices, and in a number of leading games already allow players to manage, limit, or turn off spending, but those features are not prominently advertised. Most parents don't even know that they exist, and game companies intend to keep it that way. Just putting up a website highlighting that these tools exist doesn't do much of anything if you're not constantly promoting these tools in games that feature loot boxes with pop-ups that say, hey, if you're a parent, maybe you want to look into these tools. And the process of activating these tools, it's not something that is particularly user-friendly to boot, which doesn't help matters for most people, for the average Joe who might not be all that technically savvy. And to close off the statement, the UKIE said, we will also continue to work constructively to support our players in partnership with government and other organizations. Oh, fuck off. All you guys have been doing is ignoring feedback from players, from researchers, ignoring evidence, denying evidence, and only pretending as if you're being proactive through useless solutions, through useless implementations. These game publishers, these game organizations, all they've been doing these past few years is sabotaging the regulation of loot boxes, the ability to keep loot boxes fair and to actually disclose the proper information to spotlight their potential danger. They've been going out of their way to discredit the research and evidence that highlights the obvious. They've been going out of their way to ensure that the status quo is maintained as far as loot boxes go, because at the forefront of their mind isn't the artistic integrity of these games, it isn't the safety and happiness of customers, it's profit first and foremost. Everything else is irrelevant. But yeah, as far as the most recent developments go, this is everything you need to know. I hope you found this video informative. Feel free to share your thoughts and opinions about all of this in the comments below. Thank you for tuning in, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.